beginnings. In 1769, on the island of Corsica, a boy named Napoleon Bonaparte was born into a modest noble family. Though Corsica had just been annexed by France, Napoleon grew up in a land of rebellion and unrest. His early life was marked by conflict, and from a young age, he harbored a burning desire for greatness. He was an outsider, neither fully Corsican nor French, and this sense of isolation would fuel his ambition to rise above his circumstances. Napoleon's sharp intellect set him apart. While other children played, he immersed himself in books. History, mathematics, and military strategy were his passions, and even as a child he envisioned a future far grander than his humble beginnings. At just 9 years old, Napoleon left Corsica to study at a military academy in mainland France. It was a harsh transition. Napoleon struggled to fit in among the French aristocrats, and his thick Corsican accent made him a target of ridicule. But this only strengthened his resolve. He knew that to rise in the ranks of society, he would need to rely on his mind and his strategic brilliance. By the time he graduated, Napoleon had already formulated his own theories on warfare and leadership. His experiences as a young outsider would shape his vision for the future. He dreamed not only of commanding armies but of forging an empire. Little did anyone know that this young man from a remote island would soon rise to reshape the entire European continent. Rising through revolutionary France. The year was 1789, and France was in chaos. The French Revolution had erupted, tearing down centuries-old power structures and throwing the country into turmoil. For most, this was a time of uncertainty and fear. But for Napoleon, it was a moment of opportunity. The revolution shattered the rigid class system that had once held him back, opening doors for ambitious young men like himself to rise based on talent, not birthright. Napoleon's first major break came in 1793 during the Siege of Toulon. Royalist forces had taken control of the city, and the revolutionary government desperately needed a victory. Enter Napoleon, a 24-year-old artillery officer with bold ideas. His daring strategy to capture key positions led to a decisive victory, and Toulon was recaptured for the revolution. Overnight, Napoleon became a hero. He was promoted to brigadier general, and the young Corsican's rise seemed unstoppable. As revolutionary France descended further into chaos, Napoleon's star continued to rise. While others were swallowed by the political upheaval, Napoleon navigated the turbulent waters with cunning and ambition. His reputation as a brilliant military strategist grew, and by the mid-1790s, he was one of the most promising commanders in the French army. The revolution had given Napoleon his chance, and he seized it with both hands. But this was only the beginning. Napoleon was not content with being a general. He had his sights set on something much greater: the Italian campaign. In 1796, at the age of 26, Napoleon was given command of the French army of Italy. His mission was clear: defeat the powerful Austrian Empire and secure French dominance in northern Italy. But there was a problem. The French army he inherited was poorly supplied, disorganized, and demoralized. Most commanders would have seen the situation as hopeless, but not Napoleon. He saw it as the perfect opportunity to prove himself on the grandest stage yet. From the moment he took command, Napoleon's leadership electrified his troops. He spoke directly to the soldiers, promising them glory and riches in return for their loyalty and courage. And then he led them into a series of lightning-fast campaigns that would become the stuff of legend. His strategy was revolutionary. He moved his troops with such speed and precision that the Austrians and their allies could barely react. At the Battle of Lodi, Napoleon led his men in a daring assault across a heavily fortified bridge, securing a stunning victory that cemented his reputation as a military genius. Within a year, Napoleon had turned the tide of the war in Italy, winning battle after battle against larger, better-equipped forces. His victories were not just military triumphs, they were psychological ones. He instilled in his men a belief that, under his leadership, they were invincible. By the time the campaign ended, Napoleon had not only secured northern Italy for France but had also established himself as the greatest military leader of his generation, the Egyptian dream. By 1798, Napoleon's ambitions extended far beyond Europe. He set his sights on Egypt, a land rich in history and strategically located between Europe and the British-controlled trade routes to India. The goal was twofold: strike a blow against Britain by cutting off its access to India and carve out a new empire in the East. Napoleon was captivated by the idea of following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, blending military conquest with the pursuit of knowledge and glory. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt began with a swift victory at the Battle of the Pyramids. His outnumbered forces defeated the Mamluks, showcasing the effectiveness of modern French tactics against traditional armies. Napoleon saw this as the beginning of a grand Eastern Empire. But while the land victories were impressive, the sea would prove to be his downfall. The British Navy, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, cutting off Napoleon's forces from reinforcements and supplies. Stranded in Egypt, Napoleon's dream of an Eastern Empire began to unravel. The harsh conditions of the desert, disease, and growing local resistance wore down his army. While he launched scientific expeditions and admired Egypt's ancient ruins, his military campaign was slowly falling apart. By 1799, with the situation deteriorating and word reaching him of political instability in France, Napoleon made a fateful decision. He left his army behind in Egypt and returned to France, ready to seize power in a country desperate for strong leadership. Return to France and power grab. In 1799, after the failed Egyptian campaign, Napoleon returned to France to find the country on the verge of collapse. The French Revolution had left the nation fractured, and the government, known as the Directory, was weak and ineffective. The people were disillusioned, and France was losing its place as a dominant power in Europe. Sensing the opportunity, Napoleon wasted no time. With the support of key political allies and his loyal military followers, he orchestrated a coup d'état that would change the course of history. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon overthrew the Directory in a nearly bloodless coup, establishing himself as first consul of France. The move was brilliant in its execution. Napoleon presented himself as the savior of the revolution, promising stability, prosperity, and a strong government. His popularity soared, and within 2 years he consolidated even more power, declaring himself consul for life. France, weary from years of revolution and war, embraced Napoleon's leadership. His military successes and charismatic persona made him a national hero, and many saw him as the only figure capable of restoring France's greatness. But while Napoleon portrayed himself as a man of the people, his true ambitions were far greater. He was not content with merely ruling France. He dreamed of building an empire that would rival those of the ancient world. With power firmly in his hands, Napoleon began reshaping France and preparing for his next move, transforming the Republic into an empire under his control. The coronation of an emperor. On December 2, 1804, in a grand ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French. It was an extraordinary moment in European history, a stark break from the revolutionary ideals that had fueled his rise to power. By placing the crown on his own head, Napoleon sent a clear message. He was not beholden to anyone, not even the church. His authority came from his own achievements and the will of the French people, not from divine right or tradition. The coronation was a spectacle of grandeur and symbolism. Dignitaries from across Europe attended, and the event was designed to showcase Napoleon's power and legitimacy as a ruler. But unlike the monarchs of old, Napoleon's empire was born out of revolution, and he intended to fuse the ideals of the Enlightenment with his own vision of imperial rule. He promised to bring stability, order, and prosperity to France, after years of turmoil and uncertainty. For Napoleon, the coronation marked the culmination of his meteoric rise. From a small Corsican boy to emperor of one of the most powerful nations on earth, his ascent was nothing short of extraordinary. But even as he celebrated his triumph, the rest of Europe watched with growing unease. Napoleon's ambitions were not confined to France, and his coronation signaled the beginning of a new chapter. One where he would seek to expand his empire and assert his dominance over the entire continent. The Napoleonic Code. As Napoleon tightened his grip on power, he knew that ruling France wasn't just about winning battles. To solidify his legacy, he needed to reform the very fabric of French society. In 1804, alongside his coronation as emperor, he introduced what would become one of his greatest achievements, the Napoleonic Code. This legal framework would go on to influence not only France but much of Europe and the wider world. The Napoleonic Code was revolutionary in its simplicity and clarity. It abolished feudal privileges and promoted equality before the law, principles born from the French Revolution. For the first time, France had a unified set of laws that applied equally to everyone, whether noble, commoner, or clergy. It guaranteed property rights, streamlined the legal system, and made divorce easier. However, it was far from perfect. While the code promoted certain freedoms, it also rolled back many rights for women, reinforcing patriarchal control over family life. But Napoleon's reforms didn't stop with law. He reorganized France's educational system, creating elite schools to train future leaders. He also revamped the French bureaucracy, ensuring that promotion came through merit, not birth. The concept of meritocracy, a hallmark of Napoleon's rule, would become a lasting legacy in modern governance. Napoleon's legal and institutional reforms left a lasting imprint not only in France but across Europe, where his conquests spread the ideas of the code to the countries he dominated. Despite the criticisms, the Napoleonic Code became a cornerstone of modern civil law. Even today, its influence can be seen in legal systems across the globe, proving that Napoleon's genius extended far beyond the battlefield. The Continental System. By the early 1800s, Napoleon's empire stretched across much of Europe, but one enemy still eluded him: Great Britain. Despite his military victories on the continent, the British Navy remained dominant at sea, and Britain continued to defy his rule. Frustrated by his inability to defeat them militarily, Napoleon devised a new strategy: economic warfare. In 1806, he established the Continental System, an embargo designed to cut off British trade with Europe and cripple their economy. Napoleon ordered all European nations under his influence to cease trade with Britain. The logic was simple: without access to European markets, Britain's economy would falter, and they would be forced to negotiate peace on Napoleon's terms. But the Continental System, while ambitious, proved difficult to enforce. Smugglers continued to trade with Britain, and many European nations resented the embargo, which hurt their economies as well. One of the greatest flaws of the Continental System was that it pushed neutral countries like Russia toward resentment. Napoleon's allies began to chafe under the restrictions, and even France itself suffered from the blockade. Meanwhile, Britain's global empire allowed it to find alternative markets, softening the impact of the embargo. Instead of weakening Britain, the Continental System strained Napoleon's relationships with his allies and occupied territories. The economic war was a slow, grinding battle, and ultimately, it failed to bring Britain to its knees. More significantly, it sowed the seeds of discontent within Napoleon's empire. His inability to control the global economy would become a key factor in his eventual downfall, as enemies both foreign and domestic began to question his authority. The invasion of Spain. In 1808, Napoleon made one of the most controversial decisions of his reign: the invasion of Spain. Seeking to tighten his control over Europe, Napoleon deposed the Spanish Bourbon monarchy and placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. But Napoleon underestimated the Spanish people's fierce nationalism and their loyalty to their king and religion. What followed was one of the bloodiest and most protracted conflicts of his career: the Peninsular War. At first, Napoleon's forces quickly occupied Madrid and other major cities, expecting a swift victory. But the Spanish people did not submit easily. Instead, they launched a brutal guerrilla war, attacking French supply lines, ambushing soldiers, and waging a campaign of terror against the occupying forces. The term guerrilla itself comes from this period, as small, irregular bands of Spanish fighters used unconventional tactics to harass and weaken Napoleon's army. The Peninsular War became a costly quagmire for Napoleon. Not only did it drain his resources and manpower, but it also inspired other nations to rise up against him. Britain, ever the thorn in Napoleon's side, sent troops under the command of the Duke of Wellington to support the Spanish resistance. The war dragged on for years, with Napoleon unable to fully subdue the rebellion or dislodge the British. The invasion of Spain marked the beginning of the unraveling of Napoleon's empire. What should have been a relatively simple conquest turned into a drawn-out, bloody conflict that Napoleon could not afford. The war severely weakened his position in Europe and emboldened his enemies. It was a lesson in the limits of his power, a lesson that would come back to haunt him in the years to come. The Russian gamble. By 1812, Napoleon's empire was at its zenith, but his relationship with one of his most important allies, Russia, had soured. Tsar Alexander I resented Napoleon's domination of Europe and the strains of the Continental System on the Russian economy. When Alexander began trading with Britain again, Napoleon saw it as a betrayal. Determined to teach Russia a lesson, Napoleon embarked on one of the most ambitious and disastrous military campaigns in history: the invasion of Russia. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, the Grande Armée, with over 600,000 soldiers from across his empire. Confident in his abilities, he believed that a quick, decisive victory would force the Tsar to capitulate. But Russia was a vast, unforgiving land, and the Russians employed a brutal strategy of scorched earth. As Napoleon's army advanced, the Russians retreated, burning their own towns and fields, leaving nothing for the French to take. The invasion dragged on through the summer, and by September, Napoleon reached Moscow, only to find it abandoned and set ablaze by the retreating Russians. The victory he had sought was hollow, and with winter approaching, his army was far from home, exhausted and undersupplied. Napoleon waited for a Russian surrender that never came. As the first snows fell, he made the fateful decision to retreat. The retreat from Moscow was a nightmare. Harried by Russian forces and brutal weather, Napoleon's once mighty army was decimated. By the time they reached the safety of French territory, only a fraction of the original 600,000 soldiers remained. The Russian campaign was a catastrophic failure, and it marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. The retreat from Moscow. As Napoleon's forces turned their backs on the burning city of Moscow, a new enemy emerged, the unforgiving Russian winter. What had begun as a grand campaign to bring the Tsar to his knees had devolved into a desperate fight for survival. Napoleon's soldiers, weakened by months of marching, battles and hunger, now faced sub-zero temperatures, snow and ice. Supplies were scarce, morale was shattered, and the relentless pursuit by Russian forces turned the retreat into a bloodbath. Thousands of French soldiers froze to death in their sleep. Horses, the lifeblood of Napoleon's cavalry and logistics, perished by the thousands, leaving the army unable to move quickly or carry what little supplies remained. Starvation set in, and in their desperation, some soldiers resorted to cannibalism. Napoleon, normally so decisive and commanding, could do little to stop the collapse of his once invincible army. The Russian army, along with local militias, harried the retreating French at every turn, ambushing stragglers and picking off entire units. What had once been a proud Grande army was reduced to a pitiful remnant, stumbling through the snow. Of the more than 600,000 men who had marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 would make it out alive. The retreat from Moscow wasn't just a military disaster, it was a psychological blow to Napoleon's empire. His aura of invincibility was shattered. For the first time, the world saw that Napoleon could be defeated. As news of the catastrophic retreat spread across Europe, his enemies, many of whom had been biding their time, began to rise against him. The Russian campaign had set in motion the chain of events that would lead to Napoleon's ultimate downfall. The Battle of Nations. By 1813, Napoleon's enemies had grown bold. Sensing his vulnerability after the disastrous Russian campaign, the major European powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, formed a new alliance to finally end Napoleon's dominance. This coalition, known as the Sixth Coalition, rallied their forces to take down the once invincible emperor. The stage was set for one of the largest and bloodiest battles in European history, the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations. Napoleon, still a brilliant strategist despite his setbacks, managed to gather an army of over 200,000 men, but he was vastly outnumbered. The coalition forces, totaling over 350,000, converged on Leipzig in October 1813. For 3 days, the city and its surrounding fields were consumed by fierce combat. Napoleon fought valiantly, employing every tactic at his disposal, but he faced an impossible situation. His enemies had learned from his previous campaigns, adapting their strategies to counter his brilliance. As the battle raged on, Napoleon's forces began to falter. His once loyal allies turned against him, and even some of his own generals began to question whether victory was possible. On the final day, with his army crumbling and surrounded on all sides, Napoleon made the fateful decision to retreat. But the retreat was chaotic, and thousands of his soldiers were cut down as they fled. The Battle of Nations was a crushing defeat. Napoleon lost over 70,000 men, and his empire began to collapse. The illusion of his invincibility was shattered, and Europe could finally see the cracks in his once mighty empire. The coalition forces, emboldened by their victory, pressed on, determined to bring an end to Napoleon's reign. The first exile. After the devastating defeat at Leipzig, Napoleon's empire quickly unraveled. One by one, his allies deserted him, and by early 1814, coalition forces were advancing on Paris. Facing mounting pressure from all sides, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne on April 6, 1814. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, France was no longer under his control. The once great emperor, who had reshaped Europe with his military conquests and reforms, was now a prisoner of his own ambitions. The coalition powers spared his life but exiled him to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. Far from the grand battles and palaces that had defined his rule, Napoleon found himself confined to a tiny island, ruling over a population of just a few thousand people. Though he was allowed to retain the title of emperor, it was a hollow recognition of his former glory. On Elba, Napoleon had little to do but reflect on his meteoric rise and spectacular fall. But Napoleon was not a man to give up easily. Even in exile, he kept himself busy reorganizing Elba's government, infrastructure, and military, all while plotting his return to power. He knew that Europe was far from stable, and the restored Bourbon monarchy in France was deeply unpopular. Despite his defeat, Napoleon still had loyal supporters in France and within the military. He watched and waited, knowing that his moment might come again. In February 1815, after less than a year in exile, Napoleon made a daring escape from Elba. With a small band of loyal followers, he sailed back to France, determined to reclaim his throne. His incredible comeback, known as the 100 Days, was about to begin. The 100 Days in Waterloo. Napoleon's return to France in March 1815 was nothing short of miraculous. When he landed on the southern coast, he was met by royalist troops sent to arrest him. But instead of capturing him, the soldiers joined him. As Napoleon marched north toward Paris, more and more troops rallied to his side. By the time he reached the capital, the unpopular King Louis XVIII had fled, and Napoleon was once again the Emperor of France. His return to power, known as the 100 Days, reignited hope among his supporters but sent shockwaves across Europe. The coalition powers, stunned by Napoleon's bold comeback, quickly mobilized their forces to stop him. They knew that if Napoleon were allowed to regain control of France, the wars that had plagued Europe for over a decade would reignite. Determined to end the Napoleonic era once and for all, Britain and Prussia led the charge to defeat him. The final confrontation came on June 18, 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon, ever the brilliant tactician, believed he could outmaneuver his enemies once again. But this time he faced an opponent he could not overcome. The British, led by the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians, under General Blücher, had learned from years of battling Napoleon's armies. Despite his best efforts, Napoleon's forces were outmatched. 4 hours, the battle swayed back and forth, but by evening the coalition forces gained the upper hand. A final, desperate charge by Napoleon's elite Imperial Guard was repelled, and with that, the battle, and Napoleon's fate, was sealed. Defeated and exhausted, Napoleon fled the battlefield. The dream of restoring his empire had ended, and with it, his reign over Europe. Final exile and legacy. After his defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon's empire was beyond salvation. This time, the coalition powers were determined to prevent any chance of his return. In June 1815, Napoleon was forced to abdicate for the second and final time. But rather than exile him to a nearby island like Elba, his enemies sent him to the remote island of Saint Helena, a windswept rock in the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from Europe. There, Napoleon would live out the rest of his days in isolation, far from the empire he once ruled. On Saint Helena, Napoleon's world shrank dramatically. The man who had once commanded armies, reshaped governments, and redrawn the map of Europe was now a prisoner, closely watched by British guards. His health deteriorated, and he spent much of his time dictating his memoirs, reflecting on his life, his victories, and his failures. Napoleon knew that his legacy would be debated for centuries, and he was determined to shape how history remembered him. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. Though his empire had crumbled, his legacy endured. Napoleon had transformed France, modernizing its laws, institutions, and infrastructure. His Napoleonic Code became the foundation of legal systems around the world. Militarily, he had reshaped the art of war, and his campaigns were studied by generals for generations. But perhaps most of all, Napoleon left a lasting impact on Europe itself. His conquests spread the ideals of the French Revolution, challenging the old monarchies and laying the groundwork for the rise of modern nation-states. Though Napoleon's empire ultimately fell, his name would live on. His story is one of ambition, genius, and the relentless pursuit of power. And even in defeat, Napoleon remains one of the most iconic figures in history.